We are going to dive right in and get started. So as most of you know, but in case anyone on the call has been asked to join by a colleague at the last minute and it's a little bit unfamiliar, RISE is an international research program investigating how education systems can overcome the learning crisis. We kind of have three components to the work that we do. The first is conducting original research in 7 countries. And all of that work is rooted in the systems framework that we're going to be discussing today that we've developed into the RISE diagnostic. The second element is synthesizing that work into a set of messages about how systems work and how they can be improved. That's the work that the team that I'm a part of and the facilitators of all of your breakout rooms who you met a few minutes ago are all part of that sort of research synthesis team. We're also working on developing those messages into a set of tools that can be used to help improve systems, and the diagnostic is one of those tools. The final thing that we're doing is building a community of research and practice around systems research, and many of you have already been involved in the RISE community of practice. If you haven't so far, welcome, you're now officially a member. There's a lot of fantastic organizations doing related work that we've been really lucky to be able to be a part of and to connect to each other. So I'm going to fly through these because these are things that all of you know very well, but the starting point for any RISE discussion is with the learning crisis. Nearly all children today enroll in school, and yet the majority in low and middle income countries fail to master foundational skills in reading and math. One framework that's very helpful for understanding why so many children fail to reach mastery is to think about learning in terms of learning trajectories. And RISE has a whole other parallel work stream on learning trajectories. And essentially, you can think of a learning trajectory as the time that a child is enrolled in school and the skills or competencies that they gain during their time in school. So in order to reach a threshold learning goal like basic reading or an aspirational goal like writing an essay, children need to be on a steep enough trajectory, so the purple line. If children are on a flat learning trajectory, they may drop out of school because they're not making progress. And even if they persist in school, they're not going to reach the threshold goal no matter how long they stay. And unfortunately, this is the pattern that we see in many developing countries. This is data that Jason used to create learning trajectories from 18 different countries using data from UNICEF. And you can see that overall, the average is very flat with only about 60% of these 18 countries on average, children getting foundational literacy skills. Some countries do a little bit better, but many sort of see very persistent flat learning trajectories. So the RISE diagnostic, I was called into a group earlier because someone had a question about this. What's the history and background of the RISE diagnostic and how does it relate to other frameworks? So it starts out rooted in a framework that was used in the 2004 World Development Report, which was about delivering services for the poor and offered a general accountability framework for service delivery that relates the state to frontline ministries providing services to clients and beneficiaries, and thinks about the relationships between them. So that framework was adapted to be applied to education systems, and it's the foundational framework that underlies the work that the RISE country teams are doing. And over the past couple of years, we've also been working on adapting this to be not just an academic analytical tool, but also a practical tool that can be used to think about understanding a system to prioritize policy intervention. And that's the work of the systems diagnostic that we're going to be talking about today. We, before the pandemic, had the opportunity to do a pilot in Ghana, and since 2020 have made progress on trying to do a pilot in Uganda, which is now ongoing, and are very excited to now be in the stage of doing a number of pilots all at the same time through this small grants framework, which a couple of the organizations on the call today are a part of. And we're also very excited to be sharing it with others who see opportunities to apply it in their work. So the essential premise of the framework starts from the acknowledgement and sort of constant reminder that to change anything in education, you need to change the interactions between teachers and students in those poorly performing systems with flat learning trajectories. The reason why those learning trajectories are flat is that students are sitting in a classroom and teachers aren't succeeding in making progress on building up their skills. But what we offer in a systems lens on the learning crisis is to say, yes, that's the interaction that needs to improve, but the constraints on improving that interaction may not lie with the students and the teachers. They may lie in the system that they're embedded in. And so to make meaningful progress on improving the productivity of teacher-student interactions, we want to look at all of the things around the teacher and student that are opportunities for them to improve or constraints on their improvement, and have an analysis of those to then think about policy interventions that can move the needle on the learning crisis. The other thing that we sort of point out is systems are performing so poorly, marginal incremental change is not going to help us reach, not going to do enough to reach a universal literacy goal like what we have in the SDG. We need sort of dramatic systemic change. So an analogy that is really helpful for thinking about what we mean by a systems analysis and systemic change is to think about a person being ill. So if someone has a set of symptoms, fever, weakness, chills, and sweating, there's a number of different symptom treatments that you could offer them as a direct treatment for the particular thing that's making them feel bad. So they have a fever, you could try to cool them off with an ice bath. They're feeling weak, you could offer them a hearty meal. But you could go through and do all of those symptom treatments and not actually cure the underlying disease, not necessarily make them feel really any better. And in fact, some of these, the set of symptoms that you have, some of the symptom treatments would act at cross purposes with each other. And you would sort of be left in no different place than you were where you started. And what's missing, of course, is a diagnosis of what's making the person sick. Once you know why they're sick, you can offer a treatment that's actually curative and would put them on a path to feeling better. So we see this kind of symptom by symptom treatment everywhere we look in the education sector. So to give, I'll just walk through one example because we're short on time, but basically all of the symptoms listed here are common problems that people point to in failing education systems: not enough materials, teachers not showing up to class, students dropping out, the system is poorly managed. And many, if not most, of the education interventions that we see are projects that aim to address one of these symptoms. So no textbooks, go out and buy books. And offer them for free in low resource settings. So there's a paper that probably many folks are familiar with of Glevy, Kramer, and Moline. This is the textbooks, the RCT of providing free textbooks to schools in Kenya. And if you're familiar with this paper, you know that they gave out free books, but they found on average no improvement in students' learning outcomes. However, they did see heterogeneous effects where the better performing students in the class did benefit from the textbooks, even though the average, on average, there was no effect. And so that's the headline of the RCT. Textbooks just alone don't work to improve learning outcomes. But if you dig a little bit deeper, what you find, and they talk about this in the paper, is that the books were in English. That's because they were the official books, and the official Kenyan curriculum for secondary school was in English. But most students didn't read English well enough to benefit from those books. And so they had books that they couldn't really do anything with to improve their learning outcomes. And that's why the intervention failed. The other point that the authors make in this paper is that the fact that the books were in English and the fact that the curriculum was so far ahead in its assumptions about students' English language skills is a reflection of the overall elite orientation of the system in Kenya. So from the failure of this symptom treatment, we can actually learn something systemic about the Kenyan system. With that diagnosis, you could think about designing interventions that could actually help students improve more than just providing free textbooks, which only helped the best off students. The example in green is from a RISE paper in Madhya Pradesh in India. I'm not going to get into it right now, but just to say, we see lots of examples of this where there's an RCT that's done of a particular intervention that looks promising and doesn't end up working out. And if you look at why it didn't work out, you sort of can learn something about the overall system. And if you had gone to that diagnosis first, you might have been able to design an intervention or set a priority that would have been more effective. And so we want to offer a framework for doing that diagnosis, not just as sort of the ex post on a null effect as a result of an RCT, but actually prospectively to try to understand the system and think about where would we set priorities for intervening and what would we intervene to do. And so the way that we want to think about this is a system. The definition of a system is a set of elements and the relationships between elements and how they interact to produce outcomes. So the first thing we have to do is set out what are the elements in our system that we want to focus on and what relationships between those elements do we want to pay attention to. And we want to look at 4 important relationships. The first is the relationship between citizens and the highest authorities of the state. So the executive, legislative, and fiduciary authorities. Not necessarily a democratic relationship. This can take many forms, but that's sort of the place that we want to start. What's the politics, the relationships between the citizens and the authorities that are in charge of the state. The next relationship that we want to look at is something that we call compact. This is the relationship between those highest authorities of the state and the education authorities that are responsible for providing education services. So this is an interesting relationship that sometimes, I think too often overlooked. And I think one of the most interesting contributions that the RISE framework makes is to say, let's look at the relationship within government between the executive and the financial authorities and the folks who are tasked with actually providing education services. And when we say, the folks tasked with providing education services, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is the Ministry of Education, but in many systems, there are actually multiple different actors or agencies that have responsibility for some element of education service provision. So, for example, in many states, religious authorities have either a parallel education system or also some role to play in the main state education system. In many countries, the curriculum or exam board operates as an independent agency in parallel with the Ministry of Education. In many systems, there's a Ministry of Education that's responsible for providing education services, but because teachers are civil servants, they're actually employed through a parallel sort of human resources, civil services agency. Maybe there's some state that has all of these, but these are all different possibilities. So when we say compact relationship, it's not just President's Office and Ministry of Finance to Ministry of Education. It's President's Office and Ministry of Finance to all of the government agencies responsible for any element of service provision, and also non-government ones. So in a system that has a private sector, which many do to different degrees, whether it's the agency that regulates the private sector or just the way that the government interacts with the private sector, that's also something that you would think about in terms of the compact relationship. So that's compact. Management relationship. This is, I think, 9 times out of 10, when someone says to you, I'm thinking about the education system, they're actually saying that they're thinking about the management relationship. So that's a common question we get is, oh, I'm looking at the education system, and then I want to think about, how other things interact with the education system. In the RISE framework, most of those other things actually have a home in this framework, and the management relationship sort of within the ministry, that's just one element, one of the relationships that we want to consider as part of the framework. And so management is the relationship between those education authorities and the frontline providers. So district officials, schools as organizations, school leaders, and teachers. There are a lot of relationships embedded within there. And of course, you can also talk about management as the relationship between a school leader and a frontline teacher. So the management relationship is very complicated, but we sort of group all of those together under management, and then encourage folks to think about which elements of management that they want to highlight, or sort of slotting in the multiple different management relationships that exist all under that heading. But it's doing a lot of work in the framework, because it is where a lot of the action is, and traditionally where most of the attention is when we think about intervening in the system. And then the last relationship is the relationship between, we call voice and choice, between the recipients of services, so children, parents, and communities, and the frontline providers, school leaders, teachers, and schools. So one thing that you notice right away here is that those frontline providers are really in a pinch, because they are the agent of two different principles in this relationship. So now we're going to go into our first breakout session, and each group is going to, we're paired up, as you guys realized, into two different organizations and two different systems that you're focusing on. So you're going to choose one system that's represented in your group, and discuss who the principals and agents are for the compact relationship in that system. And if you have time, you can also get into a discussion about who the principals and agents are for the management relationship in that system. All right, everybody, welcome. Oops, sorry. Welcome back. In the interest of time, we're not going to do a whole 10 minutes report out from plenary, but is there one group that wants to share briefly what they discussed and who they identified as their principals and agents? Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're gonna leave it there rather than going to another group, but I hope everyone had a good discussion and sort of was able to start thinking through some of these issues. And like Montserrat said, in most systems, I think it really is a constellation of actors in that agent role in the compact relationship. And one of the things that this framework can encourage us to do is to think really critically about that constellation. And where the power really lies, and who's reporting to who, and what the structure is of that. So glad that you were able to have that discussion. So we know the four relationships that we want to be thinking about. And I'll say right off the bat that you'll notice in all of from now on in the presentation, you won't hear us speak too much about the politics relationship. We might talk a lot about politics in all of its, and it's a word that can, refer to lots of different elements of the system, and they all have their politics. Even within a government agency, there's a lot of politics. But in terms of the relationship between citizens and the state authorities, we won't spend a lot of time in the RISE framework and the diagnostic framework talking about that relationship. It would require, I think, its whole own separate framework, and there is a whole separate stream of RISE work just looking at that. We're going to focus our attention sort of from compact on down in the diagnostic analysis. So we have the three relationships that we're mainly going to be focusing on. What issues do we want to look at within these three relationships? So that's the next element of the framework, and there are 5 what we call design elements, or I'm going to refer to them as elements for the rest of the presentation. 5 elements that we want to consider about each of those 3 relationships. And all of these kind of relate to different aspects of, taking principal agent theory or principal agent relationship as a paradigm. So different aspects of what you would consider in any classic principal agent problem, with one special addition for education, which we'll talk about. So the first element that we're going to consider is delegation. What is it that the principal is asking the agent to do? Now, this is a really interesting element, because it's probably where we have the biggest gap between among the biggest gaps between a de jure and a de facto, or sort of a lip service delegation and an actual delegation. So you might spend a lot of time thinking about, there's what someone makes in a speech or what's written down in official policy as what's delegated. And then there's sort of what's actually credibly delegated, what the system, actually cares about based on what it's financing, what it's gathering information about, and what there's a general sense of as being valued within the system. So it can get very complicated to parse that. On the other hand, it's among the most important elements because it's what sets out the agenda. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about different aspects of delegation and thinking through that as you do the analysis. The second element to consider is finances. Montserrat was sort of asking about the word fiduciary in there, which is just a fancy way of saying finances. What resources the principal gives to the agent to carry out their task. So within this, we'll talk both about like sort of amount of education financing, but also the way that financing is structured. Is it decentralized or centralized? How much control is there over it, given at different levels of the system? Something else that comes up under finance is the way teachers are financed and selected and compensated. This is obviously critically important because that's where the bulk of spending happens in any education system. And so we talk about that under the finance element. The next one is the sort of special addition for an education system that we've decided to add is a special design element for support. So the assistance or training that the principal provides to the agent to help them do their job. This is most critical in the management relationship, where we want to think about pre-service and in-service teacher training. And there's a conception of the framework where you could lump this in under finance, because you could say like the resources that get devoted to training. But it's so critical in education that we think it's worth pulling out and having its own separate discussion about the way that teacher training and teacher preparation happens. You can also think about support in the context of the compact and the voice and choice relationships, and we'll have some discussion over that, but it is more, mostly in the management relationship that this element is relevant. The next item is information. So how does the principal evaluate the agent's performance? This is, what gets reported up to different levels of the system to account for how well different actors are doing. In most systems, there's some kind of exam structure. Exams are part of information, but there are all sorts of other types of reporting, EMIS, different types of financial accounting that have to happen. Those all fall under information. And you can learn a lot about what the system is prioritizing based on what information is being used to adjudicate how well different agents are performing. And the last element is motivation. So this is how the agent's welfare is contingent on their performance. And notice this is separate from finance because there's how agents are compensated, but there's also the norms around their performance, how they feel about themselves and their job. And of course, there are types of compensation that could be non-pecuniary, but are also sort of built into the structure of the system. So things like, if where you get placed in your, being placed in a rural area versus in an urban area could be a big factor in motivation, also something to consider here. So putting all of these together, we get, and this is sometimes called the accountability triangle. It looks more like a box, but there's sort of 3 points to the box, so that makes it a triangle-y box. But this is sort of a visual way to lay out the relationship among the different elements. So like we said, citizens to the state, this is politics, and that's mediated by delegation, finance, support, not really, information and management. The compact relationship, the state, executive, legislative, or fiduciary authorities to the education authorities, and again, mediated by delegation, finance, information, and motivation. Then there's the management relationship, those education authorities to the frontline providers. These together are the educators themselves in the management relationship. And then finally, we have what's sometimes called the short route of accountability. This would be the long route all the way around to frontline providers. And this is the short route, citizens and parents exercising their voice and choice directly on frontline providers. The way that we more commonly, for an analysis perspective, look at this is in a matrix, and you'll hear us talk about the 5x4 matrix. So the 5 design elements and the 4 relationships that come together to form the system. And the core hypothesis of this framework is that the performance of the system is the result of the feedback loops and interactions between these actors. And those feedback loops and interactions produce learning when enough elements are aligned or coherent for a learning goal. And so for the rest of the day today, you're going to hear us talking a lot about the different possible orientations or types of the system that we can see, and asking ourselves, are these aligned for learning? Are they aligned for something else? Are they coherent with each other? Are they incoherent with each other? That's the main core question that we're going to be asking as you do an analysis with this framework. Before we dive into doing that analysis and talking about the different possible orientations of the relationships, there are 3 important concepts for understanding the different diagnostic types or orientations that I just want to run through very quickly, and that you'll hear us talk about and that come up in the descriptions of the different types. So the first concept is the idea of the technical core. And the definition that I'm using here comes from a paper that UAE, who's on the call today, one of our team members, wrote with Lant, and she generated this very pretty donut diagram. And so the idea that she and Lant talk about in their paper is that organizations are effective from the inside out, that any effective organization has a core mission or purpose and a core set of technical practices that help them achieve that purpose. And that the other elements of the organization, the things that they procure, their legal compliance with laws and regulations, their accounting and finance, and their human resources. In an effective organization, those are support functions that are sort of secondary to and supportive of the core technical practices that are aligned with the purpose. And that in ineffective organizations that become ineffective for a variety of reasons, you can see if the technical practices or the core purpose break down, you often see things like human resources or legal compliance or EMIS becoming the most important thing in the organization, and the technical core sort of shrinks and loses its way. So that's the concept of the technical core, and UAE will jump in the chat if I've said anything incorrect in the definition, or if she wants to add anything to that. The second concept is accounts versus accounting. So this comes from a paper that Dan Honig has with Lant Pritchett. And the idea of this is to separate out different types of accountability. So accounting accountability, as they talk about it in their paper, is when accountability is reduced to sort of thin, digitizable, emisable bits of information. So adding up how much money is spent and isn't spent, any sort of bean counting exercise. Did you tick the box, yes or no, tick, tick, tick. Those are all accounting accountabilities, and they're important and they have their place, and we need good sort of management practices around making sure that there's compliance for the types of accounting that need to happen. But then they also suggest that there's this other kind of accountability that's even more important in some cases, called accounts. And what they describe this as is thick narratives justifying actions and explaining, why a particular decision was taken and what the outcome of that decision was. And so for a lot of complex activities, as with education, it can be important to have an accounts component of accountability to be able to sort of communicate the outcomes of different actions and sort of justify what has taken place. And then the final concept is isomorphic mimicry. This comes from a book called Building State Capability of Matt Andrews, Michael Woolcock, and also Lant. And this is the idea that organizations, if they're not able to perform the task that they've been assigned to perform, they'll sometimes protect themselves by starting to look like a more capable, adopt all of the outside look of a capable organization, but actually as a protection mechanism, because they aren't really capable of delivering the thing that they're meant to deliver. And this concept comes from biology. So these are two different snakes. And the one on the top is a very dangerous venomous snake. And the one on the bottom is not dangerous at all. It's totally benign, but it's evolved over time to look really similar and have this sort of very similar color pattern to the dangerous one. So it's free riding on the danger of the top snake. And so organizations that struggle with capability sometimes do the same thing. They'll make sure that they have the outside look of a more capable organization to sort of obfuscate from their poor performance. And it's called isomorphic mimicry. Okay, so with all those concepts in mind, we are going to dive into thinking about different possible types or orientations of the education system that we're going to be thinking about in the analysis. So there are 6 types that we have proposed to think about. And I should say right from the bat that the purpose of this is not to come to one perfect, pure, this is the type for our system definition. The purpose of this is to draw on these different types to come to a useful description of the system. So for any relationship and for the system overall, you're likely going to have bits that you draw on from multiple types. You could probably tell a story about different, corners of the system that display characteristics of many, if not all of these types. But the purpose is to use this to come to a useful shared understanding about what's really going on in the system. So let me just quickly run through what the 6 types are. The first is oriented for learning, where relationships of accountability are aligned around all children learning. There are clear goals for learning that are articulated, financed, and supported. This is like in our sort of case, the ideal, right? This is what we want to see. Learning is at the center of the education system. The next type is oriented for selection. These are systems where relationships of accountability are aligned around selecting a deserving few students to move on to a higher level of education, to get a credential, or and then, based on that, to secure a place in higher education or, an important signal in the job market. In systems like this, you often see that credentials are serving a really important signaling role in the job market, even if the actual learning that they represent might be less than what we would hope in terms of what students' capabilities are for having achieved that credential. The next type is, I think maybe what I would argue anyway, the second best after a learning type, which is a system oriented around access. So where all of the mechanisms of the education system are pulling together towards expanding the number of students who are enrolled in school at the primary level, and then, once achieving universal primary, pushing for as many students as possible to attend and complete secondary school. So this is sort of like the MDG, the Millennium Development Goal orientation, right? Like, let's get all children to school, make sure that we have universal access. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing, but if the system is only oriented around access, it's not necessarily thinking enough about quality. The next type is an interesting one that's mostly relevant in the compact relationship, but is an important one to consider, especially from a political perspective, and that's oriented for socialization. So when relationships of accountability and sort of the purpose of the system is very focused on a particular ideology, or an ideology sort of puts a negative sound to it. It could be a more positive way to say it would be values. So religious values or civic values at the center of the system. These are something that you see commonly in systems that have like a strong language policy. When you have sort of state building and language policy as an important part of state building, You can see an orientation for socialization. It can go very well with orientation for access, right? If you're trying to get everyone socialized into a common language, you're going to have a strong language policy, and you're going to want everyone to get into school to get socialized together around that same identity. Next, we have orientation around special interests or patronage. So these are when relationships of accountability are sort of prioritizing short-term or clientelist objectives, giving out jobs as goodies in the education system, directing resources in the education system to preferred ethnic groups, geographically. Also so that's one set of sort of short-term clientelist things. Under this type, we also, because we needed a place to fit it in, include relationships that are dominated by special interest groups, and in some parts of the world, teachers' unions are, a really important constituency, and in some systems really dominate a lot of the decision-making in the education system. So this is patronage or other special interests sort of grouped together under one type. And then finally, a type that often coexists with many of these, especially orientation for selection or for access, is orientation for process compliance. So this is kind of the archetype of when we were looking at that technical core diagram, where with the technical core in the middle and the support functions on the outside, systems where the technical core is very weak and all of the support functions, the IT, the procurement, the HR, have come to be dominant, and the system is sort of existing to comply with the bureaucratic rules of the system and has lost its way in terms of the education mission that it's meant to be achieving. So orientation for process compliance, also something you see, a lot of isomorphic mimicry often in systems that are oriented for process compliance. And again, can definitely coexist with an orientation for selection or orientation for access. So I think next, one more slide, okay. I thought we were going to breakout rooms. So what we do sort of functionally with these different orientations now that we've defined them is we look within a relationship at the different design elements, and we say, based on what we're observing, what orientation or what type do we think is dominant in this relationship? So we've offered and again, in those annexes that I was talking about when I said the guts of the diagnostic, what we've offered is a set of suggestions of what we would expect to see in a system that was oriented, say, for learning or oriented, say, for access. So for the management relationship in a system oriented for learning, we would expect to see the ministry expecting teachers to deliver a curriculum that prioritizes foundational skills for all. We would expect to see, flexible financing with local discretion to allow for innovation around learning. We would expect to see things like, coaching and really robust support to teachers to help them implement the curriculum. We would expect to see exams that are aligned with the curriculum and sort of some monitoring systemically of how learning progress is happening, not just at the end of the cycle, but sort of periodically throughout schooling, so the system is tracking progress. And we would expect to see, teacher career structures that are designed to attract, retain, and recognize good teaching. So not just to focus on, do you meet some minimal qualification standard for the degree you need to have to be a teacher, but actually, trying to motivate good teaching and good teaching practices. And then we, for a system oriented for access, we would expect to see all of those elements, more focused on expansion. So the delegation is to get more kids in school for longer. Financing doesn't offer a lot of discretion. There isn't really a lot of, in-depth teacher support because the focus is on just getting kids through the curriculum, not necessarily a lot of concern about giving teachers the support to really deliver it. All of the information focus on enrollment and sort of minimum standards for what it means to be a good school, as meeting the minimum qualification for what schooling needs to be, and a more sort of tenured civil service oriented teacher career structure. So we're a little bit behind. So I'm going to combine, we were supposed to have 2 more breakout groups, but since we're running late, we're going to combine them. So I'm going to say what this discussion question is and then move on, and we'll combine it with the next discussion question. But the first discussion question is, to again choose, you don't have to choose the system here, but just thinking about these different orientations, having a discussion about what you think the assessment structure or assessment approach would look like in a system that was oriented for these various different purposes. So make a note of that. Your group leaders are also going to make a note of that, and that will be one of 2 discussion questions that we'll do in a longer breakout in a couple minutes. So putting all of that together, we can see how we would start to sort of assemble an idea of what's the overall alignment for a relationship. So you would look again at management and say what's really being delegated, what's really being financed, what's really being supported, how is information working in the system. And what you're very likely to find is different orientations within the same relationship. So in this example, the Ministry of Education is delegating an expectation of a curriculum that prioritizes foundational skills for all. And there is a great coaching sort of system in place to help teachers deliver that curriculum. But when you look at information, you actually see that the exams are only at the end of secondary school. There isn't a lot of monitoring of progress on foundational learning. And the exams actually that they do at the end of secondary school aren't really aligned very well with the curriculum. There's some mismatch between the exams and the curriculum. And so what you would see in that situation is something that we would call incoherence. So this is the second concept that the framework can help us to unearth. The first is the orientation of the different relationships. And the second is how aligned or coherent are the relationships and the design elements within each other? Are they moving in the same direction, or are they aligned for different purposes? Identifying those incoherences can be really helpful for starting to think through what are some areas of intervention that might help to create better alignment and actually unlock progress around learning. Sort of thinking back to the example that we talked about at the beginning of the textbooks, the textbooks in Kenya, identifying the incoherence between children's learning levels and the pace of the curriculum. If you had done that before you had designed the textbook intervention, you might have designed a very different intervention than just providing the same free textbook. So the idea of unearthing these incoherences can help you think about what to prioritize for actually improving learning outcomes. So the second discussion question that you'll take into the breakout rooms, which we're going to join in a minute, is to try to think through and discuss an incoherence that you've encountered in your work and see if you can describe it in terms of the RISE framework, in terms of these relationships or design elements. I would just mention both to the RISE team members and also to everyone else that you have access to this slide deck in the links that were sent out in email, and RISE folks, we have this on our team Dropbox if you want to pull up the slides at all during your discussion, if it's helpful to take a look. So combining the breakout rooms from before, just to remind you, we're going to have a joint discussion of how assessments look across different types. So try to talk about that for about half of the time, and a discussion of an incoherence you have encountered in your work, and we'll take 15 minutes for talking about these 2 questions in our groups. Hi guys, sorry about that. I was just saying we only have a few minutes, and so rather than a full share back, I was going to ask UAE, could you maybe share a couple of points that came up in your group's discussion? Great, yeah, both really interesting points that I think highlight different aspects of the types of discussions that come up as you start to think through the framework and the issues that it raises in detail. So with just 1 minute left, I want to make a final point. which is sort of the last step of the diagnostic analysis on the previous slide, was, like we said, thinking through the features that we see in different elements of the various relationships and identifying areas of coherence and incoherence. And then the last step is, once trying to look at different possible incoherences, again, we've developed as a suggestion a set of common incoherences. So the first thing, of course, is to use your own knowledge and sort of any data collection activities that you're doing to identify incoherences in your system. But we've put together a list of the common incoherences that we see across systems, and I'm not going to talk through all of these now. They're available in this deck and also in the annexes, but this can be a useful place to start to sort of check and see, are any of these incoherences relevant in your system. And with that, we are at the end of the first session. So this has been a lot. Thanks everyone for sort of sticking with us for 2 straight hours and for all the attention and participation. We're going to take a 15-minute break now for everyone to go get something to eat, do some emails, whatever you need to do. And we will reconvene at 12 p.m. Eastern time for a session that Jason is going to lead, sort of talking about how we take all of these ideas that we've just shared in this session and practically put them into action to do a diagnostic exercise. So have a great break, and we'll see you back at 12 p.m.
All right. Hi again, everyone. I think it is time, so I'm going to get us going. So let me just quickly introduce myself first. I'm Jason Silberstein. I'm a research fellow with RISE, and I've been developing the diagnostic alongside Marla, and actually was also part of the team that piloted an earlier version of the diagnostic in Ghana over 2 years ago. So great to be with you here today. Right, I'm here to review the diagnostic kind of implementation process. So as we go into hour 3, we are going to take a break from this kind of more abstract, big ideas, systems thinking that hurts the brain a bit, and turn back towards some more kind of practical considerations about how to implement the diagnostic. And so what I'm going to talk us through is a kind of verbal version of the implementation guide that was shared on Dropbox and over email. And I'll just say, or emphasize again, like Marla did right at the top, that the word guide in this implementation guide is very intentional. It's not a recipe, and we as RISE kind of want and expect it to change, and for you to iterate as you pilot. Great. So yeah, we are in the end of day 1 here, this last bullet point in day 1. All right. So yeah, before we get into the steps in this implementation guide, I thought it would just be useful to kind of remind us of the purpose of the diagnostic, which I guess, provides the logic for choosing these steps and structuring them like we have. So I think there's these twin purposes of the diagnostic, which are these 2 boxes at the top. So, the first is to apply systems thinking in these 2 dimensions we've been talking about. Are the parts of the system oriented towards learning? And how well are the different parts of the system working together? Are the parts of the system coherent? And so the idea, first of all, is to have an exercise that can help everyone engage with those systems thinking questions and move towards a common understanding of the system. And then the second purpose is really to prioritize. So based on that shared understanding and diagnosis, prioritize some ways to take action and change parts of the system to make them more coherent for learning. And then just to jump down to the bottom box here on this slide, I think it's also just to remind ourselves, or maybe for you to keep in mind as you start to talk to your partners in the countries and contexts where you're going to be piloting, three things that the diagnostic is not. These are kind of like common misconceptions. So, one, it's really not meant as an internal exercise for donors, or even, as we've been discussing, just for Ministry of Education. It's a much broader conception of an education system. It's not a data exercise. Some folks see the use of the word accountability in the 5x4 framework and think data and dashboards, and it's not that. And finally, it's not just trying to diagnose these technical best practices. It's very much involved with the hard questions of administration and politics. Okay, so with those goals in mind, these are the kind of 6 steps that we have proposed in the implementation process. So we wanted to go through and just discuss each of these in turn. Sorry, my computer's having a hard time changing slides. All right. So first step is the inception phase. And yeah, many of you are already like into this stage, right? Like you have written these proposals and determined, yes, there is a project that can proceed. But I think the next key concern here is finding the right audience. And we envision one key means to do that is the formation of a steering committee. And so there are some different ways to think about this steering committee. One main purpose could be to gather some key stakeholders who you hope will be users of the diagnostic findings. And so membership is a kind of useful mode of ownership. Another possible use is to really think of this committee as a working committee and gather members who have a deep knowledge of the system that can actually inform some of the substance of the diagnostic. And so, those goals can be in a bit of tension also, right? Because so there's some balance to strike between getting kind of higher level political members potentially on this steering committee, which might give the diagnostic higher legitimacy, but then, people might not have as much, or there might be a risk of lower participation. And then, of course, if you have more kind of technocratic members of this steering committee, there might be lower legitimacy, but possibly higher participation. So we, to give us a chance to just explore this first step and discuss some possible challenges that might arise or opportunities that might arise in forming this steering committee, we wanted to have a quick break to discuss, and you're going to be in partners this time. We're not going to go back to our big groups, but you're going to be in partners and have a little brainstorm. Who might you want to include on the steering committee? So we're going to have, I think, 5 minutes to discuss, and then we'll come back and share a bit. Welcome back, everyone. All right, could we have, I think we have time for maybe 2 groups or so to share any points in your discussion, any, I don't know, insights or really thorny questions or comments that might have come up. So does anyone want to come in? Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. No, this idea of using the steering committee to access and get some of these stakeholders that aren't often involved in these discussions bought in, I think is a great point. Okay, let me go back to the the PowerPoint. Great. Can you see my screen? All right. I'm going to assume yes, if nobody's telling me no. Great. Thanks. Okay. Thank you for that. I hope that was a useful discussion. So step 2 that we've outlined in this process is the desk review. So the main purpose here is to actually fill in the framework and arrive at some early hypotheses about the alignment of the system and some of the key incoherences in the system. The activities here are pretty straightforward. So I'm going to just spend the moment we have to discuss this step instead on just kind of emphasizing how this might be a little different from other desk review processes. So I think first, it's worth emphasizing the importance of relying on existing knowledge within your teams, especially with the level of experience in your teams and organizations, and just hearing the quality of the discussions today. You can build hypotheses from your existing knowledge of the system. And one of the benefits we imagine of this step is kind of getting a lot of that tacit knowledge about the system, like all this stuff that is in the air that people know, but have never actually written down and therefore don't have an easy way to talk about. It's kind of getting all that stuff on paper, and then the actual document review is actually a kind of way to complement and support those hypotheses. Okay, another point that I wanted to emphasize here was just the importance of actually filling in the framework and arriving at these early hypotheses about how the system works, so that you can go into the next step, which is workshops with a clear idea, pretty clear idea already of what is happening. And then that lets you spend a lot more time on why things are happening in the system. So I think that can really help shortcut a lot of time that you would otherwise spend in the workshops, separating out, what's happening on paper versus what's happening in the real system in practice. And then you can spend that time in subsequent steps really getting at these more delicate or kind of political questions that otherwise take a long time to come up. And just last to point out, that the idea of filling in the framework in this step also lets you kind of have this bird's eye view of which parts of the system you don't have clear hypotheses about already. And then that can help you plan which stakeholders you want to spend more time with during the workshops, who are the particular principals and agents in particular relationships that you really want to focus on, that are best positioned to answer some of the holes in your hypotheses. So, okay, we're not going to break into discussion groups for this step, but are there any burning questions or any questions that come up? If you use the raise hand function, that'd be great. We can spend a minute discussing. Okay, I can't see any hands. Am I missing them, or should we keep going?
I think you're not missing any, Jason. Nobody's raised their hand.
Great. Okay, I'll keep going. Oops. All right. So, all right. Step 3 brings us to the workshops themselves. So the idea here is to run a series of workshops with relatively small groups of stakeholders that have complementary perspectives on a specific part of the system. So getting something like 5 to 8 key folks in a room, almost in kind of like focus group format. So something small enough, we're imagining, to allow for really detailed discussion about a part of the system. And the purpose is to check your hypotheses against these folks' knowledge and their diagnosis of the system. So the idea is to have multiple workshops, of course, or focus groups that zoom in on different parts of the system in turn. So, for example, one key workshop might try to get, thinking about the incoherences we were talking about earlier, try to get the curriculum, the exam, and the teacher training people all in the same room to talk about and get at the coherence of those different parts of the system. Another way to think about these workshops and start to divide them up and plan them out is that, besides having different functional functional aspects represented in a workshop, you probably want to plan workshops at different levels of the system, right? So you might have one workshop with district staff and then a separate one with school level stakeholders if you're trying to triangulate perspectives there, but then you don't want to mix too many different power dynamics in the same workshop or in the same room, so you might want to hold those separately. So and the steering committee we were talking about just a second ago could be another natural workshop. And just maybe one other point to emphasize here is that in the implementation guide, we've suggested making these workshops as concrete as possible, or kind of as closely tied to the framework as possible in terms of actually presenting parts of the framework to respondents and then facilitating them to actually use some of the structure and vocabulary of the framework to diagnose the system and get at how they see the system. And some of the detailed tables in the annexes that Marla was mentioning, which we're going to explore in depth tomorrow in part 2 of this training, we hope will really help you structure these conversations in the workshops. Okay, so that brings us to our second discussion here. We wanted to give you a chance to discuss what are some potential challenges you see in these workshops, and how could you mitigate those challenges? And then one particular challenge you might want to discuss in this conversation is how to make de jure versus de facto distinctions in these workshops, and really separate out, what is the real system versus what is the paper system. All right, Katie, can you send us to our pairs for 5 minutes of discussion on these questions? Great. Hi, everyone. Can we have a few volunteers to share some highlights from your conversation about the workshops? Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Javier. Yeah, and actually, just to pick up on your last point, I mean, one other reason that we've suggested this kind of workshop format is that some of the most productive conversations from the pilot in Ghana really came from having this exchange of viewpoints and getting on, having different perspectives in the room, try and arrive at a common understanding, and kind of, like you're saying, move towards some kind of less academic and more kind of like shared basis for action kind of exercise, rather than just having, one-on-one interviews where you're just isolated, you're just a respondent to a more academic kind of project. So like building that shared understanding, I think it can be a really useful byproduct, both for ownership and for like insights into how the system actually works. That's a great question. I don't know if I have like a generalizable principle to share that will kind of like tell you the right answer. I think it's so context dependent that you would have to judge, would your facilitation allow them to actually talk to each other in a useful way, or would you want to actually separate them out? I mean, another thing, which is actually a nice segue to the next part of our conversation, is, you might consider having a workshop where you get them together, but then actually follow up in one-on-one interviews where folks might be more comfortable in sharing, what they actually think, or just going deeper into an opinion because that other person is not in the room, and the power dynamic or the whatever is causing the conflict is not so apparent. So I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah.
Jason,
Yeah.
can I come in with a, oh, sorry.
Please go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Montserrat, I think one, that's a big challenge, and it's it's similar to the de jure de facto challenge, right? Because it's almost, which doesn't come from a place of conflict in that case, but comes from a place of everyone is just discussing the way the system is supposed to be on paper, but can't get past talking about the paper version to talk about the actual system. And I think one way sort of through that for both, whether it's you're dealing with folks who have like a political agenda and are just repeating the party line for their group, or folks who are unwilling to take the risk of deviating from just saying everything is perfect and exactly as it's supposed to be, is thinking about who from within your different stakeholders you're selecting to be a part of that workshop. And that will determine, what kind of environment gets creating, and is there, within the teachers union or within the teachers union constellation, some individual who is more willing to engage in an actual evidence-based discussion and not just repeat the party line. And can you invite them, or if even in any public setting they wouldn't be able to speak, can you have a one-on-one conversation with them? And bring in the evidence that they would have to share by selecting who within the different stakeholders that you're engaging with. So that's one suggestion I would have about that.
Yeah, no, Marla, I'll just very quickly add on. I think another way to manage this and get the most out of these conversations is, like we were saying before, to show up with as deep a set of hypotheses as you can, so that you can point out during these workshops to stakeholders, is that really how it works, and gently kind of challenge them on these more standard narratives that they might be giving you. And I mean, just to say, so for example, in Uganda, the team that is implementing the diagnostic there right now, one example that came up is that every teacher apparently prepares two different parallel lesson plans. Like one is speaking to the new curriculum, and they have to have this lesson plan that corresponds to the new, I think it's competency-based curriculum, in case somebody comes to observe them and monitor them. But then there's also the real lesson plan that they actually use in their classrooms. And if you didn't show up to the workshop, it might take a long time for that to emerge and for that to become a topic of conversation. But if you know that, you can directly pose that question to them. Hey, we've heard there are these two parallel lesson plans. Like, why is that? What's going on? How does that reflect how the system works? So anyway, sorry, I just wanted to add that. Let's move on because we're running short on time. Great, thank you for that discussion. So this next step, follow-up interviews, has already come up, and this we're suggesting as a very important but subsidiary step or subsequent step to the workshops, and thinking about using them in kind of targeted ways where the workshops might fall short in for example, the ways that Carly was starting to bring up. So some reasons for having these interviews might be, to follow up on points where there is debate in the workshops, to follow up where power dynamics in the room kind of prevented something from being explicitly discussed in detail, or as we've been saying, to really try and separate out this in more depth, the de jure versus de facto distinctions, and have a situation or have a setting where you can really challenge and probe in a bit more depth than might be possible in a group. Okay, let me keep going. Right, so then step 5 is analysis. And this is, of course, where you compile all the findings from the workshops and interviews. And our hope is that, if you use the framework and these annex tables that we'll discuss more tomorrow and show to you tomorrow, this will be a pretty structured process where you can go through and build up an overall characterization of the system. So the main steps here are developing a narrative description of each element and then each relationship and their main orientations, and then looking for incoherences. Again, how well are the different parts of the system working together? And just to flag again, to guide this step of looking for incoherences across the parts of the system, Marla kind of flashed on screen earlier, and one of the annexes that we've put together, which describes common incoherences that RISE research or RISE synthesis of RISE research has pointed to. And we're hoping that this can just kind of prompt your team to consider some particular incoherences and see if they resonate in the system you're studying. But we're also excited for you to identify and kind of propose new kinds of incoherence that come up in your studies. Okay, let me pause. Any questions on this analysis step? Okay, no, I'll keep going to the last step, and we have one last discussion at the end of this step. So yeah, the last step we've outlined is a prioritization workshop. And so the goal here is to bring your narrative of the system and the main kind of incoherences that you've identified to your steering committee, and then hopefully use the steering committee as a way to agree one or two, or I don't know, maybe three places or incoherences where there's the greatest margin for action in your context. So, the idea here being that a systems analysis that produces this kind of long laundry list of needing to change everything is not useful, right? And that's one of the common worries or critiques that we often hear about systems thinking. But the hope is that having your analysis of the different parts of the system and then these discrete incoherences between them gives you kind of right size findings where you can debate changing the alignments of a few parts of the system or focusing on correcting or realigning a particular incoherence or maybe two incoherences. So the last question we wanted to pose today in your pairs was to discuss what challenges do you foresee in facilitating this prioritization workshop with the steering committee. Great. All right. Any volunteers to share what came up in your discussion? Great. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, helping develop criteria to structure the prioritization process. I like that. That's great. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's that's a good point. And I think that's where, selecting the right folks for this steering committee who might be particularly involved in this last step of looking at the findings and prioritizing where there's room for action is important. Hopefully also the diagnostic process that they've been engaged in is a way to kind of change their minds about some of this, right? Like gather some evidence for how the system is really functioning and start to have that conversation, even if it is a tough conversation. But no, that's a great point. Okay, Emily, I think we have time for one more comment. Do you want to come in? Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that comment. That's a good point. There is, and this has come up before, there's some kind of like critical mass, right, of a size of things and parts of the system that you need to change at the same time to have an impact on learning. I mean, that is the whole assumption, I think, of a systems approach, right? You can't just go about changing one thing at a time, or this kind of symptom by symptom approach that Marla was talking about. But at the same time, you don't need to change everything at once. Hopefully there is some kind of subsystem or particular incoherences that this process helps you zoom in on and focus in on and get some traction for change around. So yeah, great. Okay, unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left. So let me just close. These are great points that you're all raising. Okay, this is the last slide. Just wanted to say, the kind of product that we are suggesting you arrive at by the end is a kind of brief summary report, something like 10 to 15 pages, really not a giant technical report that folks might or might not read. And again, just has these main components we've already discussed, a narrative of the relationships and the elements in those relationships with some kind of justification from all the conversations and evidence you've gathered, and then highlight these incoherences, both overall and what the steering committee has prioritized. And that's the kind of product that we're imagining at the very end. Okay, excellent. So I realize you might be left with some general questions that you want to raise, and we don't have time for those today, but we'll try and set aside a few minutes tomorrow morning if you want to come and ask those questions. We can follow up tomorrow once everything has had a chance to kind of sink in. And just a preview for tomorrow. So tomorrow is going to be even less lecturing or talking from me, Marla, and the RISE team. And it's going to really be all about participation and discussion. So please come prepared for that. And in particular, if you have a chance to look at Annexes 4, 5, and 6 in the documents that were shared with you, we are going to really dig into these tables that we've been referring to in those Annexes 4, 5, and 6 in depth tomorrow. So if you have a chance to read through parts of those and just familiarize yourselves with them, that would be great. Otherwise, I think we can say just thank you so much for the great engagement today. I mean, it's really testament to how well you all know the systems you're working on and how familiar you already are with the ideas of systems thinking. I think the level of discussion today was awesome. So thank you all, and see you same time tomorrow.